Hi, welcome to the December Liberal Values Lab from the Institute for Liberal Values. And today we have Nafis Alam, who is an award-winning professor, newly affiliated with University of Nebraska, so congratulations on that. He's held a wide variety of jobs in the private sector. He did a stint in professional sports and has a long list of publications, both in academic and popular press. His research focus is on self-determination in sport. And lucky for us, he also has a research interest in viewpoint diversity and open inquiry, which is more the focus of today. Today, Nafis is going to share an educational application of something called the legal moral matrix. And the way that he's going to describe it is a way to help students visualize and discuss the nuances of, right and wrong, so to speak, across time and cultures, and hopefully in a way that encourages critical thinking about society and social interactions. So I realize you're on your phone right now, a bad timing for your computer update. So we're gonna, I do want you to introduce yourself a little bit and give us a little history on this legal moral matrix before how this came to be used.
Sure. So my name is Nafis. I'm currently an associate professor at the University of Nebraska. And my research agenda is sports social work, but also viewpoint diversity. And this topic, the legal moral matrix of teaching in higher education, came from a few conversations that I've had with faculty at my old university, Boise State University. And we were talking about how we go about introducing nuance in this highly political, highly charged climate that we have here. In the classroom, of course, but in greater society down the road. But within the classroom, we were talking about how there's usually a right way to think or a wrong way to think, or at least that's the impression that people get coming in. The understanding is that when we come into a classroom environment, we're just going to have these conversations, sometimes for 90 minutes, sometimes for 3 hours. But at the end of that time, we're going to reach some sort of conclusion, and we're going to be told and we're going to be taught what is right and what is wrong. And so I've essentially made a career out of not answering questions, essentially, and just continuing to ask these questions, but not answering them. And that's part of the nuance, is to leave the questions as they are and then allowing individual minds to come up with the answers to those questions. And individuals can have different answers to those questions as well. And so I proposed this idea to the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression Faculty Network Conference, which is where you and I met. And I'm so happy for our meeting and now all the work that we get to do together. And I presented this for about 15 to 20 minutes there, and got a good amount of feedback from that presentation. And it was really about a theoretical approach to how to teach and how to learn in the classroom environment, particularly in breaking down nuance into spatial dimensions. Now, I'm not a physicist, certainly. I'm a social scientist, not a physical scientist. And nevertheless, I'm very interested in that. And, who hasn't watched movies like Interstellar and other movies like that when we talk about different sorts of dimensions? And so I applied the concept of nuance into this dimensionality, right? And every dimension has two directions. It's on a plane on two directions. So if we think of height, if we think of length, we think of up and down. If we think of width, we think of left and right. If we think of depth, we think of backwards and forwards. And so that's where my idea came from, is that, as my computer starts to load up right now.
Yay!
Yeah, finally, right? That's where my idea came from, is just trying to understand nuance in a way that is accessible to hopefully to everyone, and not inaccessible in that sort of way. So to introduce nuance in this dimensional plane, we're going to be talking about the dimension of morality, which will be, let's say, a left and right direction. We'll be talking about the dimension of legality, which will be on a vertical plane. And then that's going to be the bulk of the presentation, because that's just the start of introducing nuance here. But my goal eventually is to get to a point where we can talk about nuance in 3 dimensions. And the third dimension, the depth dimension, might be something like culture, like timeline, where you are geographically could make a big difference there as well. So those are some of the ideas that we'll get into today as I pull up my presentation.
Yay. Yeah, so first of all, I loved it. Loved the quick presentation. I'm looking forward to the longer one. But one of the things that we struggle with in the classroom is that students do want one right answer. So when I teach higher level courses, it's a struggle to get students past that. And it can take all the way, can take most of the semester to convince them that there's not just, no, really, I don't think there's one right answer to this. I think no, really, I'm not kidding, and they want to force you to tell them, well, what do you want? And it's like, well, no, I just want you to demonstrate that you've thought about this and applied it in a way that demonstrates that it has maybe altered your way of thinking about your environment or about yourself, maybe even changed your thinking about your own thinking. And that any of those I would celebrate any of those things, not just a right answer. I mean, obviously, I don't want you to say something wrong about the research, but if you can extend it beyond, that's really more interesting, more what I would consider more important for especially an upper level class. So got a little feedback there. There we go.
There we go. Okay, finally. But yeah, it's true. I mean, we all strive to be accurate in what we're doing, and sometimes that means taking chances and being unsuccessful with it. So I think we need to be kinder with ourselves. That's really important. But yeah, hopefully this is something that we'll be able to be successful in doing moving forward. Introducing nuance into the classroom, introducing nuance into the just in society in general. I think that would be very valuable. So,
and giving yourself permission to not know, to sort of identify those nuances, those maybe even hypocrisies in your own thinking. It's like, well, I believe both these things at once, and they don't really go together.
True.
I'm not done yet. I'm not fully baked yet. I have to think about this more,
Exactly. So I'm going to share my screen here. Let me know if is that working?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. So I will start from a slideshow here, play from start, and just give me audio feed because I can't see anyone.
Right.
So you can see this going from.
Yes.
Yep. Okay. All right, so I'll get started with this. This is my presentation, The Legal Moral Matrix of Teaching in Higher Education. I gave a quick, brief description of what this presentation is going to be about, just keeping in mind the dimensions of nuance, which is where I really want to get to. But before we jump the gun and go there, let's just first start off by me expressing my gratitude for getting to work with the Institute for Liberal Values. You, Jen, and everybody involved. It's just been a wonderful experience. It's been a short experience, but wonderful experience thus far, and I hope to be able to continue forward for years to come. There's a lot of good work that we have to do, and I think we'll be able to make a difference here. So thank you for having me here today, and thank you for the collaborative work that we're looking forward to doing. So I'll get started with the problem. The problem in higher education today seems to be polarity and division. There's often, as we were talking about, there's often this impression that there is a right decision and a wrong decision. And we'll spend a good amount of time talking about what all of the decisions might be. But ultimately, at the end of that 90-minute class, at the end of that 3-hour class, or even at the end of a 15-week semester, there's an expectation that we get to, well, what is the right thing to do? We've been talking about this for more than 3 months now. What is the right thing to do and what is the wrong thing to do? And I think education is a lot more about the questions than it is about the answers. Case in point, if you were to ask the question of how do you communicate with one another, if that question, and I believe in really marrying the question, dating the answers, if we were to marry the question of how do we communicate with one another, the answer today would be our iPhones and our Androids and Zoom, right? Whereas if this were 100 years ago, it would be something completely different, letters, maybe telegraphs, right? So as technology advances, the answer to how we communicate with one another changes. That's also true for any question that you might have to ask. So what is the right decision today may not be the right decision tomorrow. And so one of the possible solutions to the polarity and division, leaving little room for nuance here, is that we introduce these ideas of dimensionalities of nuance. And so I really want to lean into this idea of legality and morality on a plane, and then introducing a third dimension, which we'll do toward the end of our lab today. So the goal is really to shift from polarity and division into nuance, understanding that not everything is binary, right or wrong, up or down, left or right, forward or backwards. There's more nuance there. There's a spectrum present. So we came across this legal moral matrix of teaching in higher education. It was a Medium post by Jeffrey Alexander Martin back in 2019. And you see here, there is this, the dimension of morality is on the x-axis. The dimension of legality is on the y-axis. Right away, we're introducing something that many in higher education haven't really considered, is this, multi-dimensional, two-dimensional space of considerations. Usually we think of just what is moral or immoral, particularly in the social sciences. In law, we might think of just the y-axis of what is legal, what is illegal. We might not take into account what is moral or immoral there. And certainly the physical sciences as well might be a little bit different there. But here in the social sciences, we tend to operate on a plane of what is the right thing to do, what is the ethical thing to do. I teach an ethics course. I've taught several ethics and diversity courses. And we talk about primarily what is moral and immoral, what is ethical and unethical. Right away, we introduce this spectrum of, well, there are levels to morality. And then when we also add the axis of legality, the y-axis, there's nuance there. There's a spectrum of what is and isn't legal, what it should be legal or what should not be legal is a better way of saying it. And so this being one possible solution, I want to get into a few examples of how this can be applied. This is a lab after all, so there should be somewhat of a workshop feel to it. So taking this theoretical tool, how do we turn into a practical device? Some of the simplest quadrants in this legal moral matrix include, for example here, that which is legal and moral. One such example of something that is thought to be, it should be legal, it should be moral by most students, by most faculty members, most people in a classroom, is access to educational opportunities. The majority of people, and of course there are exceptions to everything, right? But the majority of people would say that access to educational opportunities should be legal and should be moral, should be considered moral. Another quadrant that's quite simple is that which should be legal and should be considered immoral. For example, murder. Murder by the masses is thought to be something that all people should consider immoral, all people should consider illegal. Again, there are exceptions to the rule, but so far we've gone to two of the easiest and simplest examples in the quadrants. We'll certainly leave simplicity behind as we get a little bit more complex, because even within simplicity, there is nuance. And so murder may be illegal and immoral, but nuance exists in opinions of assisted suicide. Access to educational opportunities may be legal and moral, but nuance exists in opinions of greater or lesser opportunities based on demographics. For example, nuance exists when people are asked about scholarships exclusively for women, additional resources exclusively for racial minorities, but reduced resources for minority population like Asian minorities due to what some consider to be overperformance. So, taking these areas of nuance into account and understanding that even within the context of simplicity, there is a lot of nuance to take into account. We have murder, which again, it's fairly more, an overwhelming majority of people would consider it to be good that it's illegal and good that it's immoral. But assisted suicide falls a little closer to the center of this axis, right? Whereas murder might fall very far to the immoral, illegal quadrant. Assisted suicide falls closer to zero because there's greater variance. There's a greater variance of opinions. Some people believe that assisted suicide should be legal. Others believe, and those people might also believe, that assisted suicide should be immoral, but maybe less illegal and less immoral than murder. And then, of course, there are others who believe that assisted suicide should be considered a medical practice, which you might consider some of them pulling this data up toward the legal moral quadrant. And that pull will cause the actual finding to fall closer to zero there. So there are certainly people, and you could Google this and Google Scholar this, but this is a hot topic where in the United States and across the world, a lot of people have a lot of different ideas about how ethical, how moral assisted suicide might be, and of course, whether or not it should be legal, it should be illegal, and what parameters need to be met if it is going to be made legal. Similarly, as we just talked about, access to educational opportunities, a lot of people would believe that access to those opportunities should be legal and should be moral. Everyone should have access, or everyone should have the opportunity to be successful in this academic environment. Everyone should be able to access education, whether it's junior high school, whether it's elementary school, junior high school, undergraduate, graduate, PhD. There's an understanding, or there's a belief generally, that everyone should be able to at least access that. Whether or not they do, that's up to them. Whether or not they're capable of it, because there are tests involved. But everyone should have the opportunity to at least take the tests necessary, pass the assessments necessary in order to get that access to educational opportunities. So many might consider that to be legal and moral. Again, there are always exceptions to the rule, right? But if we speak about access to educational opportunities based specifically on demographics, we'll find that there's more disagreement there. Maybe having scholarships specifically for a particular gender, specifically for a particular race, might be considered less legal and less moral, as in it should be a little less legal and it should be considered a little less moral. Because now you have people that are on the immoral, illegal quadrant that are pulling that data and that aggregate finding over closer to zero here toward the middle. So here we have these examples with these four accounts essentially, where legality and morality can be taken into account to understand nuance in a two-dimensional space. Now, more complex quadrants than just the legal and the moral and the illegal and the immoral. Some more complex quadrants might be something that is legal but immoral. Legal but immoral. Some consider taxation to fall into this category, in that, I suppose it should be legal, because how are we going to build stuff? How are we going to have infrastructure? How are we going to have, a distribution of wealth in some people's minds? And then those same people might consider it still to be immoral, but it needs to still be legal according to their perspectives, right? Again, there are always exceptions to the rule. I'm going to keep repeating myself there. It's never everyone in all ways, right? So this being a more complex quadrant, we have to really dig in and understand why would an entire civilization, from an aggregate standpoint, consider taxation, just as an example, warranting to remain legal, but still be considered immoral. Taxation is theft, some people like to say, yet they're still here paying taxes. So there's a little bit of a dilemma there. There's a little bit of an internal conflict, which then certainly can turn into external conflicts, and of course politics plays out. That's what makes this a more complex quadrant. There are ideas that exist in all four of these quadrants. So taxation existing in this legal but immoral quadrant would be an example. Another one is that which is illegal but moral. Marijuana use, for example. Some people consider marijuana use to be good that it's illegal generally. Some people consider it to be good that it's illegal because they might consider it a gateway drug, and thus keeping it illegal prevents it from becoming more accessible, and thus turning into a gateway drug for others to use, and then possibly try even harder substances. At the same time, those people in this nuanced context tend often to think that marijuana doesn't fall into that morality category or immorality category as much as harder drugs do, like cocaine, right? So here you'll have more nuance because it's a more complex quadrant. Many people believe that marijuana should stay illegal, but that it should also be seen as not as immoral as some of the harder drugs, and perhaps even saying that it should be moral, especially if it's for medical use, right? And that certainly is another third dimension that we can talk about. What are we doing this for? Could be one of the third dimensions. So these are some of the more complex quadrants. It's that which is legal but immoral, like taxation. That which is illegal but moral, like marijuana. And now we get to that third dimension, the nuance within nuance. And I've just covered three of them, but you can think of many other examples as what might be considered that third dimension. So if legality and morality are two of these dimensions, a third dimension, building depth, could be time, could be culture, could be experience. And so I'll go into a few examples of that. Again, this is a lab, so it should be a workshop, and this being the theoretical worksheet. Let's talk about slavery. So pre-1864, slavery was legal, was thought to be good that it's legal by the aggregate, but still considered to be immoral. And then post-1865, it was considered illegal and immoral. So in this example, time is the third dimension, right? So pre-1864, that period of time, and post-1865, that period of time. When we introduce that third dimension, we see that legality and morality, in this example, legality changes, morality remains. Now, an interesting thing is that in 2024, slavery is legal in 94 out of 195 countries. So 48% of the nations in the world do not have laws outright prohibiting slavery. And that introduces the concept of culture as an element, as a potential third dimension. Now, let's actually go back one slide before we speak about arranged marriages. So we see that time plays a factor here, and I've chosen, artistic freedom. I've chosen to speak more about time here and culture in the next slide, but you can easily apply culture here as well. If we were to take slavery and we were to take out time, then where the data falls, where the findings fall, could be different based on what country we're talking about, what nation we're talking about. Generally, this, most of us being from the United States, or at least from Western civilization, there's a tendency to think in that Western lens. We have to understand that the Western lens is not the only lens that we have that exists today. And so 48% is nearly 50%. I don't have to tell you, that's pretty obvious. I found that to be alarming, but perhaps I only found that to be alarming because I too am employing a Western lens in understanding all of this. So moving forward into a different third dimension, arranged marriages. Now, Western civilization often considers arranged marriages to be illegal and immoral, and that they should continue to be illegal and immoral. And then many other cultures believe that arranged marriages should continue to be legal and should continue to be moral. And of course, with arranged marriages, there's some nations that believe that it should be legal, believe that it should still be immoral, and vice versa. So many different ways of thinking about this, right? Legality and morality are not one and the same. They're not parallel necessarily. So you might believe that something should be legal, but still be immoral. And then you might believe that something should be moral, but still be illegal. So, and then there's data to support all of this, right? And I intentionally chose arranged marriages because I was doing I was helping out on a research study, not my own, about the success rates of arranged marriages. And the success rates of arranged marriages are standard deviations above the success rate of non-arranged marriages out of love, right? So if you want to stay married to the person that you're with, an arranged marriage is statistically significantly more likely to help you succeed in that endeavor. But from a Western civilization perspective, I don't want to marry that I don't love, someone that I don't love. I don't want to, even go out on a date with someone who I'm not attracted to. Well, that also is a Western civilization perspective to marriage, because in Western civilization, we have the privilege and the fortune of considering love when we talk about marriage. There are other cultures, and I was born in Libya and grew up in Bangladesh, so we can talk about that as well if you'd like. But, not every culture is Western civilization, and other cultures, love is not factored into marriage. What's factored into marriage are things like land ownership, political power, sometimes even just family contact with other families. So marriage being about love and love leading to marriage, that by itself is a Western civilization concept, and it's a privilege that we have. So within this third dimension, there are other mini dimensions that pop up of what does marriage mean even? Is marriage like Western civilization defines it? I love you and you love me and we want to spend the rest of our lives together. I get down on one knee and I propose and hopefully you say yes and we live happily ever after. Well, happiness and love are privileges in Western civilization marriages. In some other cultures, and I could talk about how my parents got married. They didn't know each other before they got married. That was an arranged marriage. They're still going strong. And they have grown to love each other because, what other choice did they have, essentially? And now I consider them to be my rocks, and they are the picture of a perfect marriage, in my opinion. Now, at the same time, you can appreciate other cultures, like I appreciate arranged marriages, and still be of the opinion that I would never partake in the actions of those other cultures. For example, I appreciate their relationship, but I would never agree to an arranged marriage, no matter how many times my mom tries to get me to agree. And that's a different story, not lab appropriate, but you get the idea. There's a lot of different perspectives here and a lot of different dimensions to cover. And abortion is in a third dimension that can be added or considered when it relates to experience, and experience being that third dimension specifically, not abortion just being an example, right? So the legality and morality and considerations of legality and morality individually on the topic of abortion, it's heavily based on an individual's experience, including religiosity. So you might find that people who have had an abortion in the past might be more open to it, or they might be more against it after what they've experienced. We don't know. Just because you've done something doesn't mean that you necessarily endorse that action, right? You might have done something and now you're of the opinion that this is not what we should be doing. You might also be pro-choice, at the same time never have gotten an abortion yourself. So experience or lack of experience could heavily weigh in on what your perspectives might be, including your experience with religion. And if you are of the religious inclination of abortions are religiously wrong, then you might be in a portion where you say, abortion should be immoral, should be considered immoral, and should be considered illegal. And then, of course, on the other side, there's a faction of people who are comfortable enough to outwardly say that they find abortion to be a viable birth control prevention, right? So, and all judgments aside, this presentation, this lab is not about judgment, but those people do exist. They might be of the mindset that abortions should be considered legal and should be considered moral. And so we'll have different people falling in different places. And you'll notice here too, in that just because you think something should be legal does not necessarily mean that you'll think that it should be immoral, right? So an abortion, for example, one might think that, okay, so it should be legal because there are so many different factors. There might be assault involved, there might be incest involved, there might be so many different factors. So maybe it should stay legal for those who need it, but it should still be considered immoral, right? That might be one perspective. Others might be of the opinion that it might be, abortion should be illegal, but not as immoral as some other things. So it should be illegal in the sense that you shouldn't be allowed to get an abortion. But just because something is illegal doesn't necessarily mean it's inaccessible. And if someone were to access means to get an abortion, despite it being legal, despite it being illegal, then that morality might actually be on this quadrant, the moral side of this spectrum, because circumstances must have been bad enough where you just went ahead and had to do something that is technically illegal, and we should practice more forgiving understanding of that action. So there's a lot of nuance here. We're essentially and intentionally trying not to paint with a broad brush. So this way we understand that there are so many dimensions to nuance, right? And so action versus intention is another area of nuance, which I really wanted to go into because, in addition to time, culture, and experience, which we've talked about being potential third dimensions, the action versus intention third dimension is, I find, to be talked about the least. So on the topic of abortion, since we've been talking about it, imagine that you meet someone, rather, imagine that you yourself are pro-choice. Even if you're not, just imagine for a moment that you are. And then you meet someone who is also pro-choice, and you say, "Oh, okay, so we agree on this. Great. Okay, so tell me more about why you might be pro-choice." That might be the action. Being pro-choice might be the action. But the intention behind being pro-choice, if someone tells you, well, if I'm pro-choice, it means there'll be fewer people who are pro-choice in the future because, abortions, I don't know where people believe that life begins, but, everyone would agree that an abortion would halt the possibility of life in the future. And if that means that the possibility of life in the future is halted, this could mean that someone who would be born and who would also believe in the perspectives of their parents, potentially also being pro-choice, there's one less of that person. And so we have to take into account why, not just the what, but the why. And that's a very important dimension, at least in my opinion. So what might be just being pro-choice? we have to dig further and ask why. If it's because you want fewer people alive in the future who are pro-choice as well, you might consider that to be a bad intention. In some legal circles, you might call that a bad faith reason. Similarly here, moving on from abortion, we've been talking about abortion for a good 7 minutes now. So moving on from abortion, if you yourself are pro-LGBTQ, and again, I'm not saying that you are, because there will be a lot of people that view this lab and take something from this lab, but just for a moment, imagine that you are pro-LGBTQ. That would be the action. But what if the intention was that there would be fewer people who are LGBTQ in the future? Right? If you are pro-LGBTQ, fine. We see some agreement there. That might be the what. And then if the why is that, well, I just want fewer people who are exposed to that LGBTQ perspective, and you want fewer LGBTQ people in the future, that is something that people who are pro-LGBTQ would consider a bad faith intention. So separating action from intention is an important third dimension that I think, honestly, I think this is the last one we'll get to because it's a little bit more complex. You might consider this like a fourth dimension or a fifth dimension down the road after other dimensions have been added. Because it is true that there are a lot of bad faith actors who will act like they're on your side. And essentially what they're doing is they're just saying, well, be careful what you wish for. I'm on your side because you don't understand that you are destroying yourself in this way. And, if you want to destroy yourself, then I'm all about it. So that's a bad faith intention, right? Whereas the action, you might be in alignment. If the intention is not in alignment, that could be a third dimension or another dimension that you add to nuance. What are the intentions behind people's actions? And so what are the implications here, right? So shifting from polarity and division and into nuance, the implications are these. For research, which will be quick because I understand this is a practice-related lab, not so much about research, but more about practice, but quickly about research because that's what I do. The implications are that when we publish and when we present and when we do the research that we do, I think, and I would encourage researchers and professors across the nation, across the world, to take into account nuanced perspectives, particularly when it comes to quantitative research, because quantitative research tends to have a sort of like a natural tendency to become eventually binary. Not all quantitative research, but much of it. Much of it is about what is the right thing and what is the wrong thing. What is statistically significant and what is not statistically significant? What is a good effect size? What is not a good effect size? What is valid? What is not valid? What is reliable? What is not reliable? You get the idea. So introducing more nuance here could be very valuable to understanding, and you can use the dimensionalities here as well. Now let's talk about practice, the most important part of this lab, right? From a practice perspective, the implications are these. You're going to be working with people, whether they're your peers, whether they're your supervisors, whether they're the clients that you work with, whether they're the patients that you work with. You're going to be working with people that have different lived experiences, different ideas than you. And in order to build rapport with them, it may be of value to have conversations about what their values are. And they might ask you about your values. And ultimately, whether you share your values with them or not, you might find that your values differ from theirs. That is nothing to get threatened by, right? Just because you can understand different perspectives does not mean that we have to agree with those different perspectives. In fact, that's how salmon get stronger, by swimming upstream. That's how muscles get bigger when you do resistance training. When you bench press, you don't lift with gravity. You don't lift the weight down. You lift the weight up against gravity. Squatting as well. Whatever exercise you can think of, you lift it against a force, not with a force. And as a result of that resistance training, you get stronger. Your muscles get, whether it's bigger because you're doing hypertrophy training or just more strong, not necessarily bigger if you're doing strength training, whatever it is, they become better because of resistance training. The mind works in a very similar way. if we don't challenge ourselves with ideas that we might not necessarily agree with and we might never agree with, we're not forced to grow. Nuance and acknowledging ideas that are different from our own, acknowledging values that are different from our own, do not make us weaker. In many ways, they make us stronger, just like weights make us stronger from a muscular standpoint. So, this is just one possible solution. This is just the start. The legal moral matrix is just a starting point to begin shifting into nuance. This is a two-dimensional space, and if you're able to, I would encourage you to share this perspective with others, and beginning adding this area of nuance in your practice, in your life, personal, professional, right? So this way you have these dimensions of nuance. And once you've mastered this, and I don't know if you've ever really mastered something like this. Mastering something means always being a student, right? But once you're comfortable enough with this two-dimensional space, I encourage you to add a third dimension or more dimensions there, whether that's time, whether that's culture, whether that's experience, or whether that's action versus intention, or whether that's something that you come up with on your own. I encourage you to consider the spectrum of nuance in a two-dimensional space here and in a larger dimensional space moving forward. That's my presentation, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have for me now.
Well, I have a couple questions. We do have at least one
Yeah.
typed into the. I'm getting feedback here, so hopefully nobody else is. So I was wondering when you were presenting, do you think that tests, where would tests maybe be on that? Whether that's a test in a classroom or maybe like a proficiency test, like a social worker has to take an exam to be a clinical social worker, or a teacher's exam or something like that, a graduation exam.
Yeah, testing is something that is very binary. You either pass or you fail. You either move forward or you get left behind, right? So from a testing perspective, I think what we can start to do, now this is really pie in the sky, is introduce nuanced answers. As in, well, a case vignette, and then give five or, well, maybe not five, maybe three different decisions that the client could make, or the social worker could make, or the mental health practitioner, or the doctor, nurse, whoever's watching this lab, that they can make, and then explain why this might be a good direction to go, and then explain why this might be a bad direction to go. So you can test this. It's more complex, obviously, because now every answer is right and every answer is wrong. And now you have to explain why each answer is right and each answer is wrong. But there are ways to test for this. And that's usually one of the things that I hear back most is that, well, we're in a field where you either pass or you're a social worker or you're not a social worker. You got to pass the exam. Well, true. But how can we adjust the exam, down the road to adapt to an area of nuance rather than just, this is the right answer, this is the wrong answer. Let's go into it and let's explain why this might be the right answer for one client and the wrong answer for another.
Right. So somebody asked, are there any universal morals or ethics? Do you think there would be any moral absolutes?
I have to say yes. When it comes to like murder, I think for me, it's an absolute that it should be illegal. It should always be considered illegal. It should always be considered immoral. But I also have to leave room for the idea that others might not. So while that absolute might show up through the course of conversation, I think all conversations should begin with the baseline that we don't have any absolutes. We only have relatives. And once we get through these conversations, we might have a room of 100 students, let's say. And then if 100 students agree, then we have an absolute on that particular category for that particular room. I think we have a tendency to paint with too broad of a brush by saying that just because 99.999% of the people in the world believe one thing, that means it's 100%. There's a big difference between 99.99999 and 100.
So somebody's asking how we might use this to build a study, to you know, try to, yeah, how could you use this to actually do research?
So you can do research from teaching and learning standpoint. So teaching and learning articles are fairly popular, and you would do research by first implementing it day one of the classroom. Well, I have two research ideas for this, right? So one, you can implement it day one and see how your student evaluations are. You'd have to add some, student evaluation questions toward the end of that semester. I'm sure you could speak to your administrators about how to go about doing that. They'd love to hear from you. Trust me.
Oh, I'm sure. Yes.
Yeah. So you add those questions, and then you just collect that data. It's already anonymous, and it's data based on your teaching. So you can analyze that. Or I think would be a cool idea is that you start off from a binary perspective at the beginning of the semester, and then halfway through, you tell your students that this is the direction that we're going to go. We've covered these topics from a binary perspective. So this is sort of like what the general classroom is. Now we're going to start getting into topics where we're going to be talking a lot about nuance, and this is how we're going to come into the classroom. There are no absolutes, only relatives. And we're going to talk about topics like murder, talk about topics like access to education, and we're going to build nuance into it. So when we talk about murder, that's fine. That might be an absolute in this classroom, but we're going to try and converse in such a way that we bring it to a relative. And how do we do that? By talking about something like assisted suicide, which is a lot more socially acceptable than murder is, obviously. Mm-hmm. We might consider, access to educational opportunities to be an absolute. Fine, that might be the case in this classroom, but we're going to work towards zero, work toward the middle of that spectrum, and talk about education. Access to educational opportunities based on gender, based on race, and these other things. So this way we have differences of opinions. And I think that's how we really get to do research. And student evaluations would be a big deal. I think students would be, and my hypothesis would be they'd be very positive toward that sort of environment. But at the same time, I also think that it could be confusing, because at the end of the semester, and this is something that's consistent with my student evaluations privately, I'm happy to send them to you. You'll find that some of the comments are like, I learned a lot, but I don't know if I learned what the right thing to do is. I learned a lot of different options. I don't know who I should, what I should think about this topic. I don't know who I should follow, and I don't know what I should do under these circumstances. And ultimately, we know this to be true, that the answer to every question is essentially it depends.
Well, if that's all there is, if there are only relatives, right? How could we? This is a question in the chat. How could we craft have policies or policy that sort of becomes an absolute in any way? Like, how could we ever have a policy that was an absolute if there are only relatives in everything?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And it's to have a policy around something like murder, ending someone's life. That's something that there would be so much agreement on, so much consensus on, that it would be a fairly obvious. You wouldn't even have to write that into law. It would be in law automatically. It would be in policy automatically. But I think starting off from the standpoint that we don't know where this conversation is going to take us, and then having those conversations and then adapting policy based on those conversations, rather than just assuming, I'm sure we're all on the same page together. So I'm not saying that we should just have relatives for the rest of time. I'm saying that relativity is the starting point. And then we might, through conversations and through debates and through polling, we might get to a point where we get to absolutes. But I think we have a tendency to believe that many of our opinions are facts, when in reality, we need to understand that many of our ideas of what is absolute is actually relative.
I was thinking about, one of the things I was thinking about when you were talking was the sort of the legality and morality of, say, canceling someone, and where would we be, at different times, different cultures, different geographies, and the sort of the justification of that. Well, and also the intentionality. I was thinking about that, especially with intentionality. So I don't know. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. It was sort of a floating idea. I'm not sure what to do with.
Yeah, no, it's with cancel culture. I wrote an article titled "Mic Drop Moments," and in that article, I talk about how we're all searching for these like viral Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat moments where it's like, you say something and I say something back, and everybody else is like, "Oh, like she totally owns you," like and we're just waiting for that because it is an emotional high, and you're like, wow, I just totally own someone. Mic drop. Now what happens is that if I drop the mic on you and you drop the mic on me, none of us are holding mics and none of us are able to have conversations in the future. So I think we need to practice a great deal of respect for people, and not to sound corny, love for people that think differently from us. Because yeah, there will be opportunities to just absolutely own someone in conversations and in debates, but we have to ask ourselves, is it worth it? Because if I own you or if you own me, at this point we know each other well enough that this wouldn't happen. But let's say this is the first time we met and we had a debate, and you just destroy me in that debate, I'm going to be reluctant to speak with you ever again. And I might have some good ideas to share with you for both of us to be mutually successful in our field and in our endeavors. But if I'm turned off to speaking with you, and you've already shown that you don't want to speak with me because you just dropped the mic, conversation over, where does that leave us? So I think we do, again, it may sound so corny, but I think we need to practice love and respect, especially toward who we consider to be our enemies, our conversational and debate adversaries.
Yeah, and holding people accountable for something that happened 20 or 30 years ago, is that fair? Where is that on the legal moral? It
Yeah,
may have been an illegal act that they committed when they were, 15 or something
yeah.
like that. Should we be moralizing about that when they're, 75?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's something that we're doing right now today that will be considered faux pas 20 years from
Mhm,
now. So if 20 years from now, whatever that is, as I'm doing it today, I don't know well enough to not do it.
mhm.
So similarly, if we look 20 years into the future and say, well, this might be faux pas then, that might be faux pas then, we also have to look 20 years behind into the past and say, we have to practice grace there. Our friend Jen talks about grace, right? So we have to practice grace with understanding that 20 years ago, the same social norms did not exist. So what is a faux pas today, what is cancelable today, wasn't 20 years ago.
Mhm.
So, how could we have expected those people to behave, in 2004 within the expectations of 2024? Just like we can't expect the people to behave in 2024 the way that they should quote unquote behave,
Whatever that means, yeah,
yeah, in 2044.
right. So then is policy making mostly essentially ethically, utilitarian? Is this just a utilitarian exercise?
I don't think so. I think there's policy overreach. We don't need policies for everything. And this is where some of the political stuff might come out, so I need to be careful. But like from an overregulation standpoint, we don't need policies on every little thing. It's as though policies, when I read some of them that are a little bit too nuanced and too focused, I think to myself, there's an assumption here of the worst possible version of this happening, and the most bad faith character taking this and making this something bad. And I think we need to start off with the perspective that giving each other the benefit of the doubt. And I think from a policy standpoint, there need to be policies related to absolutes, but only after the relative parts have already been hashed out.
That makes me think about, policies now around publishing, for example.
Mhm.
Certain things are shunned or withdrawn, right? This publication has been withdrawn. You can't find it anymore, and that kind of thing. And this sort of, the marketplace of ideas. You're sacrificing the potential marketplace of ideas, because again, you know, maybe in 20 years that is going to be the thing, whatever it is, you know, just because we're worried about it now, and then also looking back and pulling things out of journals, making them inaccessible, you know, when at the time the marketplace of ideas decided that that was acceptable.
Yeah. And that's, I think ideas should always be welcome to be explored. Whether or not those ideas turn into actions, that's a different story, especially if those actions are to hurt someone or you know, whether physically or emotionally or mentally. But I think ideas, especially in an educational environment, an academic environment, and I don't necessarily mean colleges and universities, there's a lot of living rooms and bedrooms that would count as academic spaces, depending on the conversations that you're having. And I think all ideas are game for conversation. You know, I don't know why we're so scared to even bring up certain topics for fear of just being canceled or not invited over for the holidays. And now, if there's something that you can't say to me and there's something that I can't say to you, those are two things that you and I cannot talk about. And we miss out on the enrichment that we can experience from one another.
So somebody wants to know if you have a favorite moral framework.
I don't. I don't have a favorite moral framework. I like considering just morality in general and just how, you know, how morality is determined. So maybe more of a historical context of why was this moral then but not moral today. And more importantly, I like taking that perspective of like, let's study history to determine what the future might be. And I really struggle in a good way because I find it to be just enlightening and infatuating that I'll just sit on the sofa, TV off, and just like hanging out, wondering, well, 40 years or 50 years ago, half a century ago, this was just not even a thing. And I can't help but think about what's gonna be a thing 50 years from now. I find that to be exciting.
So there's some some psychologists have done some research on how long it takes for people to want to build monuments, for example, for events, tragic events, you know, historical events, you know, that are positive, but also tragedies. So and there's a cycle, and it has to do with, you know, how old people are as they're sort of looking back, you know, in time. So it's money, like people have to be, you know, in their 50s or beyond to really have money to donate, you know, to these kinds of things. But there's sort of this cultural cycle about, you know, when people see this event as having been a historical turning point,
Mhm.
right? And the idea is that it takes that perspective in order to be able to see that, no, this was something that was historically meaningful, not just to me personally, not just you know, in that maybe little window of time, but across time. I now see how history has been altered by that event. And I think that if we, you know, this and how, you know, sort of overlaying that on sort of what's the legal moral matrix of, say, a monument,
Mhm.
and at, you know, and it seems like if we wait long enough we would have this idea. But of course now we've seen monuments being torn down, and you know, it's always shifting, right? So it seems like, you know, you wait a certain amount of time and it's like, oh yes, this is something that's deserving
Mhm.
of, you know, a monument, a park, you know, a named, you know, a day that's named for, you know, but then we still, you know, even after say 50 years, we still see the shift, right? And it's got to come down. Things have to be renamed. It's inappropriate and everything. So, yeah, I mean, we really do have to constantly respect, I guess, that those shifts.
Yeah, and in doing so, we have to be responsible enough and mature enough to understand that while we are in, it seems many of folks might be in the business of antiquating ideas and making them obsolete, our ideas also will one day become obsolete and
Right.
antiquated. So if we're tearing down monuments and building new ones, you can bet that one day the monuments that we've built today will also be torn down. And so that sort of creates a newfound respect for history, you know, because hopefully that will make people or help people understand that tearing down past ideas, not necessarily monuments, but like a certain day or like a certain celebration or a certain notion, like tearing it down and making it taboo, like you're just opening the door to be canceled yourself. Cancel culture eats itself. If we're going to be in the business of canceling other people, it's only a matter of time until people are in the business of canceling us.
Yeah. Well, that's not necessarily a high point to end on.
And I know you like ending on high points.
We do like to end on a high point. So I don't know. What can we say? What can we say? I mean, honestly, I think this has been so. I mean, obviously, when I saw it at first, I was really inspired by it, and I haven't been able to get it out of my head since.
Yeah.
And so I'm not exactly sure where this is going to lead, but I look forward to working with you and maybe doing something creative with this matrix.
Well,
So
whatever you want to do, count me in. I've really enjoyed our work together, and hopefully we stay working together for a long time. I guess if you want to end on a good note, I think hopefully you and I can both agree that I have faith in society. I have faith in higher education. I have faith that we're not going to continue going down the path that we have been of this binary perspective, and it's not even just binary, it's extreme binary. It's something is extremely right and everyone should do it, or it's extremely wrong and this should never be spoken about again. I have faith that people, students, faculty members, and certainly the general public, they're growing tired of this. And as they grow tired of this, there's an opening for nuance. There's an opening for us and other people, to other organizations too, to step in and say, we're here to provide opportunities to learn more about nuance. So although while we can talk about some of the negative areas and where we can do better, I think we also need to acknowledge where we're already doing well, in that people are getting tired of this binary hyperpolarization perspective, and we are due for the introduction of some nuance here. And I'm hopeful that this could be one area of nuance. But again, this is just one idea. I'm not married to this idea being the idea that brings nuance into it. I just like the idea of just having like understandable spatial dimensions of length, width, and depth, and applying that to the social sciences for all of us to be able to understand. But if there's a better idea to introduce nuance, I'm all for it.
So somebody just asked, how do you think the popular media has played into the matrix?
Well, the popular media plays into the matrix in being very hyper polarized. I think whether you're on the right, whether you're on the left, you'd agree with that. And I also want to practice love here as well. And here's how I'll practice that love. I don't think that it's in bad faith. I think it's because hyperpolarization sells. Imagine you and I are running for mayor of our town. And if my campaign is, Elizabeth is a wonderful person, I think she'll do a great job. I still hope you vote for me because I think I'm the best candidate, but I think she's great too. And if she's the winner, I'm happy to work with her. And if you also say, oh, I want you to vote for me because I think I'm the best candidate, but Nafis is a cool person, I think, he'd be a good leader for this place too. And if he gets your vote, then I'll be happy to work with him. That just doesn't get people off their seats and ready to donate money. Right. And go out there and vote. So practicing love toward our popular media, the mainstream media, they're a business. They have to make money, and they figured out what's fairly obvious to figure out is that hyperpolarization sells. And many of these folks probably aren't as polarized as they're pretending to be on TV, but they do so because it makes them millions and millions of dollars. So I think it's important to also practice love and understanding, when I talked about that action versus intention, the action might be the hyperpolarization that exists in society today, but the intention might just be that this is what business is. This is how you gain donations. This is how you gain voters, and not necessarily that they are truly that hyperpolarized.
Dr. Nafis Alam, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for sharing yourself especially this month, and going forward, and for sharing the legal moral matrix.
Thank you. I really appreciate you.
Thank you.